The date that looked perfect. And why? That's exactly the problem. Nothing was wrong. That was the first thing that scared her. The lighting was perfect. The conversation flowed like it had been rehearsed. He laughed at the right moments, leaned in at the right times, remembered small details she'd casually mentioned as if they mattered. Because to him, in that moment, they did. The city outside the window felt like a movie set, the kind where everything aligns just enough to convince you this might be the beginning of something rare. She told herself to relax. This was what a good date was supposed to feel like. And yet, beneath the chemistry, beneath the ease, beneath the intoxicating sense of being seen, something in her body didn't settle. It didn't scream, it didn't panic, it whispered, a quiet pressure in her chest. Was it a strange emotional flatness that arrived the moment the conversation paused? A feeling she couldn't name without sounding ungrateful or dramatic. So she ignored it, because nothing was wrong. That's how it always starts. Most people think dangerous relationships announce themselves with red flags waving violently in the wind. Cruel words, obvious disrespect, explosive tempers. But the most psychologically manipulative people don't begin with chaos. They begin with precision, with calibration, with an almost unsettling ability to become exactly what you didn't know you were looking for. This is not the story of a bad date. This is the story of a perfect one, and why perfection can be the most dangerous disguise of all. He didn't dominate the conversation. He didn't brag. He didn't rush intimacy. He listened. He mirrored. And he reflected her values back to her so seamlessly it felt like destiny rather than design. She left feeling chosen, elevated, special. And yet when she got home, something inside her collapsed. Not sadness, not fear. Emptiness. A hollow space where warmth should have lingered. She stood in her kitchen replaying moments from the night, trying to identify what she had missed. Had she said something wrong? Had she imagined the connection? Was she overthinking again? That question, what's wrong with me, is the first victory for someone who knows how to manipulate without ever touching you. Because the most dangerous personalities don't make you distrust them. They make you distrust yourself. They don't force control, they invite it. They don't break boundaries. They make you hand them over willingly, wrapped in logic, chemistry, and hope. What she didn't know yet was that some people don't connect to bond. They connect to extract. Attention, validation, control, access, emotional leverage. They don't want intimacy the way healthy people do. They want proximity, close enough to study you, map you, learn the shape of your needs so they can step perfectly into them. That's why it feels magical at first. Your nervous system lights up. Dopamine floods your body. Your brain mistakes intensity for intimacy and novelty for depth. You feel alive, chosen, seen. But dopamine always crashes, and when it does, what's left tells the truth. That emptiness she felt wasn't confusion. It was information. Real connection leaves you grounded, calm, warm. Even after the conversation ends, something steady remains. A sense of clarity, a quiet confidence, a softness in your body. Your manipulative connection leaves you wired, restless, replaying every word, hungry for the next interaction to recreate the high. One makes you feel more like yourself. The other makes you feel slightly lost without them. And here's the part no one tells you. Intelligent, emotionally aware, successful people are often more vulnerable to this, not less. Because manipulators don't target weakness. They target openness, curiosity, depth, the capacity to feel. If you've ever looked back and thought, how did I not see this sooner? The answer is simple and devastating. There was nothing to see yet. The mask hadn't slipped. The performance hadn't exhausted itself. The cracks hadn't formed. Because the most dangerous people don't reveal who they are when they're getting what they want, and they reveal themselves when they're no longer in control, or when they believe they have it. That night wasn't the beginning of a relationship. It was the beginning of a pattern where charm replaces character, where intensity replaces intimacy, where you slowly learn to doubt your instincts while praising their confidence. And the reason it works is because it doesn't feel bad at first. It feels extraordinary. So if you've ever walked away from a great date feeling inexplicably off, this isn't a story about paranoia. It's about precision, about learning to listen to the signals beneath the surface instead of the narrative on top. Because the most important question in dating isn't, did they like me? It's this: how did I feel when it was over and why? If this opening already feels uncomfortably familiar, you're going to want to hear what comes next. So before we go deeper, before I show you the one simple test that manipulative personalities consistently fail, take a second to subscribe to this channel. It's how you support conversations like this, and it helps make sure we can keep creating content that protects people from psychological harm instead of blaming them for falling into it. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Quick question for you. After a date that feels too perfect, which reaction sounds more familiar? A. You feel calm, grounded, and quietly optimistic afterward. B. You feel wired, restless, empty, or strangely unsettled. Comment A or B below. Your answer says more than you think, and in the next part you'll understand exactly why. The one question narcissists and psychopaths can't answer honestly. There is a moment in every conversation when the performance ends and the truth begins. It doesn't happen when someone is describing their job, their hobbies, or their favorite travel destination. It doesn't happen when they're charming, articulate, or impressive. It happens when the conversation turns inward, when the spotlight moves away from who they are to the world and lands on who they are with themselves. Emily didn't know she was standing at that threshold the night she asked it. The question didn't sound strategic. It didn't feel loaded. It wasn't designed to trap or expose. In fact, it felt almost gentle, the kind of thing people ask when they're genuinely curious about another human being. What's the biggest thing you learned about yourself during a difficult time in your life? She asked it casually, without expectation. She wasn't testing him. She wasn't guarding herself. She was simply listening. And that's exactly why the answer mattered. Most people assume manipulative personalities are revealed by what they say. In reality, they're revealed by what they cannot tolerate saying. This question doesn't ask for a confession. It asks for reflection. And reflection is intolerable for someone whose identity depends on never being at fault. For healthy individuals, even those who stumble over their words, the question creates a pause. A real pause. You can almost feel their attention turn inward as they scan their own history. Not for a story that sounds good, but for something that's true. Their answer may not be eloquent, and it may be imperfect, but it carries weight. It contains ownership. They talk about patterns they didn't notice before, about mistakes they regret, about ways they had to grow when life stripped away their illusions. There's vulnerability there. Not dramatic vulnerability, not rehearsed vulnerability, but the quiet kind that doesn't perform well on first dates. For narcissistic and psychopathic personalities, the pause feels different. It's not reflective, it's tactical. Because the question threatens something fundamental, the carefully protected image of being blameless. These individuals don't lack intelligence. They don't lack insight into others. What they lack is the ability to integrate personal responsibility without destabilizing their sense of self. So instead of looking inward, they look outward. They talk about betrayal, about how people can't be trusted, about how every difficult experience taught them to be more guarded, more careful, more selective, never more accountable. The lesson is always the same, even when the story changes. The problem was never me. And here's why this matters so much. True self-reflection requires psychological safety within oneself. It requires the belief that acknowledging fault will not result in internal collapse. Narcissistic and psychopathic traits are built on the opposite belief, that admitting fault equals annihilation. Shame is not processed, it is avoided at all costs. So the answer becomes a defense mechanism. It sounds reasonable, even mature. After all, who hasn't been hurt? Who hasn't learned to be cautious? On the surface, the words make sense. Yes, that's why this question is so dangerous. Not because it exposes obvious red flags, but because it reveals what is missing. There is no humility, no nuance, no evidence of inner movement, just a polished narrative where growth is replaced by grievance. Emily didn't recognize this immediately. Most people don't. She nodded along, empathized, even admired the strength it seemed to take to learn hard lessons. It wasn't until later, much later, that she realized something crucial had been absent from the answer. There was no self in it, no acknowledgement of contribution, no curiosity about personal blind spots, no sense that the speaker had ever been changed by pain, only armored by it. This is the core difference between someone who has been through hardship and someone who uses hardship as a shield. One is shaped by experience, and the other hides behind it. And it's important to say this clearly. This question does not require a perfect answer. In fact, overly polished answers can be just as revealing. What matters is the direction of the response. Does it move inward or outward? Toward ownership or away from it? Manipulative personalities often believe they've answered well. They mistake fluency for honesty. They don't realize that what they've avoided is precisely what healthy people instinctively include: themselves. That's why this question works so consistently. It doesn't rely on your ability to analyze body language or spot contradictions. It relies on something much simpler. It asks whether the person in front of you has a relationship with their own inner world, or whether they've spent a lifetime running from it. And there's another layer to this that makes it even more powerful. People who are capable of healthy intimacy understand that growth is ongoing. They don't present themselves as finished products. They don't speak in absolutes. They allow room for evolution. Even when they're confident, there's flexibility in their identity. Narcissistic and psychopathic personalities, on the other hand, often speak in conclusions. Their lessons are final. Their narratives are closed. They have already decided who they are and who is to blame. This rigidity is not strength, it's fragility. Emily would later realize that the question hadn't failed to expose him. It had exposed her own habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt at the expense of her instincts. She had listened to the words instead of the absence beneath them. Because the truth is that when someone cannot talk about themselves without turning themselves into the victim or the hero, they are telling you something essential. Accountability is not part of their emotional vocabulary, and accountability is the foundation of safety. You cannot build trust with someone who cannot sit with their own imperfection. You cannot build intimacy with someone who experiences self-examination as a threat. No amount of chemistry can compensate for that. This is why the question is not about catching someone in a lie. It's about observing whether they are capable of standing in truth without collapsing, deflecting, or performing. Most people don't fail this test because they're bad people. They fail it because they're not ready for depth. But narcissistic and psychopathic personalities fail it for a different reason. Depth would dismantle the very structure they rely on to feel in control. And that is something no charm can hide forever. In the next part, the contrast becomes unmistakable, because once you understand how healthy and unhealthy minds answer this question, you'll never hear the responses the same way again. Two answers, two brains, two completely different inner worlds. Emily didn't realize how much information she had been given until much later. At the time, the answers sounded ordinary, even thoughtful. They didn't set off alarms. They didn't feel wrong. But when she replayed them side by side, the difference was unmistakable, not in tone, not in intelligence, in direction. Years apart, in two different chapters of her life, each she asked the same question to two different men. The question was simple. The answers were not. Ryan answered first. He leaned back slightly, confident, composed, his voice steady. He didn't hesitate. He didn't struggle. His words came easily, as if he had told this story many times before. I learned that people can't be trusted. Every time I let my guard down, it backfires. You have to be careful who you let close. Emily nodded. It made sense. It sounded mature, even wise. Life does teach you to be cautious. Pain does harden people. There was nothing obviously alarming in what he said, and yet something subtle was missing. Years later, Daniel answered the same question. He paused. Not the calculated pause of someone choosing the right image to project, but the uncomfortable pause of someone searching their own history without knowing exactly what they would find. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, less polished. I realized I avoid conflict, he said. I stay quiet to keep the peace, then I end up resentful. I didn't see how much that was shaping my relationships until everything fell apart. I'm still learning how to deal with that. His answer wasn't impressive. It didn't sound strong. It didn't position him as someone who had figured life out. But it was alive. This is where the difference lives, not in the words themselves, but in the inner world those words come from. Ryan's answer moved outward. Daniel's moved inward. Ryan's story was about what the world had done to him. Daniel's was about what he had discovered within himself. One brain protects identity, the other examines it. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else in dating, because it reveals how someone relates to responsibility, intimacy, and growth. It reveals whether they experience life as something that happens to them or something they participate in. Ryan didn't lie. That's what made it dangerous. He told a story that felt true because it was true, just incomplete. People had hurt him. Relationships had ended badly. Those things happened. But what was absent was any sense of personal contribution. No mention of patterns, no curiosity about his own role, no acknowledgement that relationships are co-created. In his inner world, pain confirmed a belief he already held, that closeness is risky and people are unreliable. The lesson was final, closed, settled. Daniel's inner world worked differently. Pain didn't become a verdict, even it became a question. What did I do when things got hard? How did I protect myself? What did that cost me? His answer wasn't about blame or absolution, it was about awareness. And awareness is the foundation of change. This is the difference between two nervous systems, two identities, two emotional architectures. People with healthy psychological structure can tolerate complexity. They can hold the idea that they were hurt and that they played a role. They can accept imperfection without it destroying their sense of self. That's why they can grow. People with strong narcissistic or psychopathic traits cannot afford that complexity. Their identity depends on being right, justified, or wronged. Accountability feels less like maturity and more like danger, and so their inner world simplifies reality into something manageable. Villains and victims, strength and weakness, control and threat. Ryan's answer wasn't just a story about the past. It was a declaration of how he would move through the future. Guarded, suspicious, certain that harm always comes from the outside. And certainty is the tell. Healthy minds leave room for uncertainty. They don't rush to conclusions about themselves or others. They understand that growth is ongoing, that insight evolves. Their answers contain movement. Unhealthy minds rush to closure. Their answers sound resolved because resolution feels like safety. Once a narrative is fixed, it no longer has to be examined. Emily didn't know this at the time. She responded to Ryan's certainty with empathy. She saw strength where there was rigidity, and she mistook emotional armor for resilience. With Daniel, she felt something else, less dramatic but more grounding. His honesty didn't pull her in with intensity. It didn't elevate her. It didn't create fireworks. But it created space. Space to be human. Space to be flawed. Space to exist without performance. That space is what safe intimacy feels like. It's important to understand that narcissistic and psychopathic personalities are often highly articulate. They know how to speak about pain in ways that sound deep without ever actually touching it. They can describe wounds without ever exploring them. They can narrate growth without ever undergoing it. This is why people get confused. They hear emotional language and assume emotional capacity. They hear insight about others and assume insight about self. But insight that never turns inward is not insight, it's observation. The real divide isn't between confidence and insecurity. It's between reflection and deflection. Daniel didn't present himself as healed. Ryan presented himself as finished. And finished people are dangerous because they believe there is nothing left to learn about themselves. This difference shows up later in conflict, in accountability, in repair. When challenged, someone like Daniel might feel uncomfortable, defensive, even embarrassed. But eventually he can listen. He can process. He can integrate feedback without collapsing. Someone like Ryan experiences challenge as threat. Not because the feedback is unfair, but because it destabilizes the narrative he depends on to feel safe. So he deflects, minimizes, blames, rationalizes, not consciously, automatically. And this isn't about good versus bad people, it's about capacity. Capacity for self-examination, capacity for repair. Capacity for intimacy that doesn't require control. Emily would later realize that she hadn't fallen for the wrong words. She had fallen for the absence of discomfort. Ryan's answer was smooth because it didn't require him to feel anything vulnerable. Daniel's answer was quieter because it did. Growth is rarely loud, and the most important thing she learned wasn't how to spot the right answer. It was how to listen for where the answer comes from. Does it emerge from curiosity or certainty? From movement or closure? From self-awareness or self-protection? Two answers. Two brains. Two inner worlds moving in opposite directions. Once you learn to hear that difference, you can't unhear it. And from that point on, dating stops being about chemistry alone and starts becoming something much more powerful. Discernment. In the next part, that discernment deepens. Because the most dangerous confusion isn't between honesty and deception, but between insecurity and manipulation. But what if they're just insecure? The most dangerous confusion. Emily asked herself that question more times than she could count. What if she was being unfair? What if she was projecting past wounds onto someone new? What if what she was sensing wasn't manipulation at all, but insecurity? That question felt compassionate, reasonable, mature. It also kept her stuck longer than anything else ever had. Because insecurity and manipulation can look similar on the surface, especially early on. Both can show up as hesitation. Both can involve self-focus. And both can make a person seem guarded, intense, or emotionally complicated. And when you care about being kind, when you pride yourself on empathy, it becomes dangerously easy to excuse behavior that should be examined. The confusion doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from goodness. Insecure people are often deeply self-aware. They worry about how they're perceived. They second-guess their words. They feel exposed when they open up. Their fear points inward. They ask themselves, am I enough? Did I say the wrong thing? What if I mess this up? Manipulative personalities ask a different question entirely. How do I maintain control? That distinction changes everything. Emily didn't recognize it at first because both insecurity and narcissism can involve vulnerability. Both can involve sharing pain. Both can involve emotional intensity. But the direction of that intensity is what separates safety from danger. Insecure people reveal themselves clumsily. They hesitate. They contradict themselves. They sometimes overshare, then retreat. Their vulnerability is unpolished because it isn't strategic. It isn't designed to produce an effect. It's a side effect of caring. When an insecure person talks about their past, there's uncertainty in their voice. They're not sure how they come across. They may lower their gaze, fidget, or pause too long before answering. Their body language reflects self-consciousness. They feel exposed. Manipulative personalities do not feel exposed. They may talk about vulnerability, but their nervous system doesn't register risk. Their openness is controlled, curated, delivered in a way that draws you closer without actually letting you in. And they share just enough to appear human, but never enough to lose power. Emily noticed this difference only in hindsight. When Daniel talked about his flaws, there was discomfort in the room, but it felt honest. He didn't seem proud of his insight. He didn't present it as a strength. He was simply acknowledging something unfinished within himself. There was no attempt to manage her reaction. With Ryan, it was different. He spoke about pain with confidence, about betrayal with clarity, about lessons learned with finality. His words were smooth, emotionally literate, even compelling. But there was no vulnerability in his body, no uncertainty, no sense that he was risking anything by sharing. That's the tell most people miss. Insecurity comes with fear of judgment. Narcissistic manipulation comes with fear of loss of control. One contracts inward. The other scans outward. An insecure person worries they might be misunderstood. A manipulative person watches to see how you respond so they can adjust. Emily had mistaken composure for strength. She had mistaken certainty for self-awareness. And that mistake is common because we're taught to admire confidence. We're taught that hesitation signals weakness. We're taught that people who speak clearly about their boundaries and beliefs must know themselves well. But real self-knowledge doesn't always sound confident. Often it sounds tentative, curious, ongoing. Insecure people don't feel superior to you. If anything, they often feel beneath you. Their fear doesn't drive them to control your behavior. It drives them to manage their own anxiety. The manipulative personalities feel entitled to shape the emotional environment. They don't just want to be understood. They want to direct the narrative. When something doesn't go their way, they don't turn inward. They turn strategic. This difference shows up in how they handle discomfort. An insecure person becomes quieter when they're unsure. A manipulative person becomes sharper, more articulate, more persuasive. They don't withdraw. They escalate, they push, they probe, they reframe. And here's the part that's hardest to accept. Manipulative people often feel calm while you feel confused. Your nervous system is doing the emotional labor for both of you. Emily would leave conversations feeling unsettled, replaying her words, wondering what she had missed. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, grounded, certain. And his emotional state remained stable while hers fluctuated wildly. That imbalance isn't chemistry, it's asymmetry. Healthy interactions create shared regulation. Even when there's awkwardness or vulnerability, both people move through it together. Manipulative interactions offload emotional uncertainty onto one person while the other maintains control. This is why the just insecure explanation becomes so dangerous. It causes empathetic people to overfunction, to compensate, to explain away behavior that consistently leaves them feeling destabilized. Emily told herself she was being patient, understanding, kind. What she was actually doing was normalizing emotional imbalance. Insecurity improves with reassurance, consistency, and safety. Manipulation worsens with accommodation. The more you adjust, the more power shifts. An insecure partner feels relief when you're calm. A manipulative partner feels opportunity. And perhaps the most important distinction of all lies in how each responds to your boundaries. Insecure people may feel hurt by boundaries, but they ultimately respect them. They might need reassurance. They might need time. But they don't punish you for asserting yourself. Manipulative personalities experience boundaries as rejection or defiance. They don't respond with curiosity, they respond with pressure, guilt, withdrawal, subtle consequences. Emily noticed that when she took space, Daniel checked in gently. When she took space from Ryan, the energy shifted. The warmth cooled. The connection felt conditional. That conditionality is not insecurity, it's control. It's also why this confusion persists. Manipulative people are often very good at borrowing the language of insecurity. They talk about fear of abandonment, about being hurt, about past wounds. But their behavior doesn't match the vulnerability they describe. Their words invite care. Their actions demand compliance. Insecurity says, "I'm afraid I'll lose you." Manipulation says, "You shouldn't make me feel this way." One seeks reassurance. The other assigns responsibility. Emily eventually realized that the question she needed to ask herself wasn't, "Are they insecure or narcissistic?" It was simpler and far more revealing. Do I feel safer being myself with them or more careful? Insecurity doesn't make you walk on eggshells. Manipulation does. Insecurity doesn't make you doubt your reality. Manipulation does. Insecurity doesn't make you feel like you need to earn emotional stability. Manipulation does. This distinction isn't about labeling people, it's about protecting your nervous system, about recognizing when compassion is being used against you. Because the most dangerous confusion isn't mistaking manipulation for confidence. It's mistaking manipulation for vulnerability and calling it love. Why you feel amazing with them. Then empty right after Emily didn't question the high while she was in it. That would have ruined it. When she was with him, everything felt sharper, colors brighter, music richer. Her laughter came faster, louder, more easily than usual. Time slipped. Hours passed unnoticed. Conversation felt electric, like discovery rather than small talk. She felt awake in a way that was almost intoxicating, and as if something dormant inside her had finally been switched on. This, she thought, must be chemistry. But the real signal didn't arrive until later, long after the goodnight hug, long after the door closed, long after the city noise faded into the background. It arrived in the quiet. She would sit alone, phone face down on the table, heart still beating faster than normal, and notice a strange emotional drop. Not sadness exactly, not disappointment, more like a hollow echo where warmth should have stayed. The energy that had filled her body just an hour ago vanished, leaving behind a restless, unsettled feeling she couldn't explain. She told herself this was normal. Excitement fades, adrenaline comes down. Maybe she was just tired, but the pattern repeated itself too consistently to ignore. With some people, she left conversations feeling calm, grounded, and quietly content. With him, she left feeling charged, and then oddly drained, as if something had been taken rather than shared. The difference wasn't emotional sensitivity, it was chemistry of a different kind. What Emily was experiencing wasn't connection, it was stimulation. There's a crucial distinction most people are never taught. Not all emotional intensity is bonding. Some of it is activation. Some of it is neurological arousal mistaken for intimacy. And manipulative personalities are exceptionally good at creating that state. Dopamine is the brain's reward chemical. It's released during novelty, anticipation, pursuit, and uncertainty. It spikes when something feels exciting, unpredictable, or just slightly out of reach. It's the chemical behind obsession, craving, even the urge to just talk a little longer. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is the bonding chemical. It's released through safety, trust, consistency, and mutual regulation. It doesn't shout, it settles. It creates a sense of calm presence rather than urgency. Both feel good, but they feel good in very different ways. Dopamine makes you lean forward, oxytocin lets you rest back. Dopamine keeps you thinking. Oxytocin lets you stop. When Emily was with Daniel, conversations didn't spike her nervous system. They unfolded. There were pauses, silences that didn't need to be filled. She didn't feel high, but she felt safe. The feeling stayed with her afterward, not as excitement, but as steadiness. With Ryan, it was different. Every interaction felt charged. He seemed endlessly attuned to her reactions, and he knew when to push and when to pull back. He reflected her energy so precisely it felt like synchronicity rather than strategy. She felt intensely seen in the moment and intensely unsettled afterward. This is the signature of dopamine-driven connection: intensity during contact, emptiness after separation. Manipulative personalities often don't consciously think, "I'm going to trigger dopamine in this person." But they instinctively know how to create novelty, intrigue, and emotional contrast. They ask the right questions, offer selective validation, withhold just enough warmth to keep you engaged. The emotional rhythm becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is dopamine's favorite trigger. Your brain begins to associate them with excitement, anticipation, relief, validation. Yet you start looking forward to the next interaction not because it nourishes you, but because it promises another hit. And when it ends, your nervous system crashes. That crash is not weakness. It's biology. Real connection doesn't require recovery time. It doesn't leave you emotionally dehydrated. When something is rooted in safety and mutual presence, the good feeling lingers. You may miss the person, but you don't feel destabilized without them. Emily began to notice something else that mattered. After dopamine-heavy interactions, her thoughts raced. She replayed conversations, searched for meaning, analyzed tone, wondered when she'd hear from him again. Her attention stayed hooked long after the date ended. After grounded interactions, her mind went quiet. She slept better. Her body softened. She didn't need to interpret anything because nothing felt ambiguous. Ambiguity is another dopamine trigger. Manipulative people often create emotional ambiguity without appearing overtly confusing. They give just enough affirmation to feel close, but not enough consistency to feel secure. They oscillate between warmth and distance, presence and absence, intensity and withdrawal. Each shift resets the dopamine cycle. Your brain responds by trying harder. Emily had mistaken this effort for emotional investment. She thought the reason she felt so preoccupied afterward was because the connection mattered more. In reality, her nervous system was trying to regulate an artificially induced high. This is why people often say, "I don't know why I'm so drawn to them." The draw isn't emotional compatibility, it's neurological conditioning. And here's the most deceptive part. Dopamine can feel like aliveness. When you've been lonely, bored, or disconnected for a long time, that rush can feel like waking up. It can feel like proof that something special is happening. Manipulative personalities often enter people's lives during moments of transition, after a breakup, during stress, or when identity feels uncertain. Dopamine fills the gap quickly and convincingly. But it doesn't build. It consumes. Over time, Emily noticed that the highs needed to get higher to feel the same. Longer conversations, more intense disclosures, more reassurance, more emotional labor. The connection didn't deepen. It escalated. With Daniel, depth grew quietly. With Ryan, intensity spiked repeatedly without ever settling into safety. That's another critical distinction. Depth creates stability. Intensity requires maintenance. One expands your life, the other narrows it. Emily eventually understood that the emptiness she felt afterward wasn't longing. It was depletion. Her body was signaling that the interaction had taken more than it gave. This realization didn't make the pull disappear overnight. Dopamine bonds can be powerful, especially when reinforced over time. But once she recognized the pattern, she could no longer unsee it. She stopped asking, "Why do I feel so attracted?" She started asking, "How do I feel when it's over?" That question changed everything. Because your nervous system does not lie. It doesn't care about charm, potential, or explanation. It responds to safety and threat, nourishment and depletion. If you consistently feel empty after interacting with someone, that emptiness is not a mystery, it's a message. Real intimacy doesn't leave you chasing the next moment to feel okay again. It doesn't make you feel emotionally hungry. It doesn't hook you with anticipation and abandon you with silence. Emily didn't need to diagnose anyone to protect herself. She didn't need to label Ryan as anything. She only needed to honor what her body had been telling her all along. Amazing in the moment, empty afterward. That wasn't romance. It was a cycle. And once she learned the difference, attraction stopped being the deciding factor. Regulation did. In the next part, that regulation will reveal something else most people overlook. Because the patterns don't just show up in how someone makes you feel, but in who actually stays close to them over time. The social proof trap, why they rarely have close local friends. Emily didn't notice it at first because she wasn't looking for it. When Ryan talked about his life, it sounded full, busy, interesting. He mentioned friends often, stories from trips, inside jokes, people he'd known for years. On the surface, it painted a picture of someone socially connected, well-liked, experienced. There was no obvious loneliness, no awkward gaps. But there was a pattern she only recognized later once she learned how to listen differently. None of those friends were nearby. They lived in other cities, other states, sometimes other countries. They were friends from the past, friends he used to be close to, friends he still kept in touch with. People who existed safely at a distance, preserved in memory or occasional messages, in but absent from his everyday life. At first, Emily told herself this was normal. People move, careers change, adult friendships are hard to maintain. She didn't want to read into something that could be easily explained by circumstance. But as time went on, the absence became louder. There were no spontaneous plans, no longtime friends dropping by. No one who really knew him in the present tense, no shared history unfolding in real time. His social world felt oddly weightless, full of names, light on presence, and that absence mattered more than she understood. Close local friendships require something that manipulative personalities struggle to sustain. Consistency over time without performance. They require being seen across moods, stress, boredom, conflict, and routine. They require repair, accountability, and the willingness to be ordinary and still remain connected. Charm works at a distance. Control works in short bursts. But intimacy, real intimacy, requires endurance. People with narcissistic or psychopathic traits are often excellent at forming initial connections. They can be magnetic in small doses, engaging, attentive, even generous. But over time, maintaining closeness becomes costly. The mask slips. The effort exhausts them. The relationship starts to fracture. So instead of adapting, they rotate. They move cities, change circles, rebrand themselves, or keep relationships shallow enough that depth is never required. Long-distance friendships are ideal for this. They provide social proof without social accountability. Ryan could talk about being a great friend without anyone nearby who could confirm or contradict that narrative. Emily began to notice how differently Daniel's social world looked. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't impressive. but it was present. He had friends who lived close enough to show up, friends who had seen him tired, frustrated, and unremarkable, friends who teased him gently, disagreed with him openly, and still stayed. There was no mythology around these relationships. They weren't stories from another life. They were ongoing. That's when Emily realized something crucial. Healthy people are embedded in context. Manipulative people curate context. One allows you to see them in multiple roles. The other controls the frame. This isn't about popularity, it's about proximity. Local friendships create friction. They introduce variables you can't manage easily. They expose patterns. Even if someone consistently struggles to maintain close relationships with people who see them regularly, that struggle will eventually show up in romantic relationships too. Emily remembered how Ryan explained his lack of nearby friends. There was always a reason. People were jealous, people were unreliable, people had disappointed him. He spoke as if closeness inevitably led to conflict, and conflict inevitably proved others unworthy. There was no curiosity about his role in those breakdowns. No sense of loss, just dismissal. That dismissal was another form of control. By framing others as flawed or disposable, he protected himself from introspection. By keeping people at a distance, he protected himself from exposure. And by presenting a socially full life without local intimacy, he avoided the one thing that could disrupt his narrative: witnesses. Witnesses remember patterns. Witnesses see contradictions. Witnesses don't reset when you change the story. Emily also noticed something else. When they went out together, Ryan never ran into anyone he knew well. There were acquaintances, polite greetings, surface-level familiarity, but no warmth, no shared shorthand, no sense of history. With Daniel, it was different. Running into friends meant stopping, laughing, being teased, being included. Emily didn't feel like she was stepping into a performance. She felt like she was stepping into a life. This difference isn't accidental. People who rely on manipulation often need new audiences. They thrive in environments where they can present selectively and withdraw when challenged. Long-standing local relationships make that difficult. They demand continuity between who you were yesterday and who you claim to be today. So instead, manipulative personalities often create a sense of motion, travel, change, reinvention. It looks adventurous, free-spirited, unattached, but beneath it is avoidance. Emily began to understand that the absence of close local friends wasn't a flaw in Ryan's life. It was a feature. It allowed him to remain undefined, unchallenged, unanchored. And here's the part that makes this trap so effective. Most people don't want to judge someone for being alone, especially kind, empathetic people. We assume there must be a reason. We fill in the gaps with generosity. But patterns don't need condemnation. They need recognition. It's not suspicious to lack friends in a new city, and it's not suspicious to have gone through social losses. What matters is whether there is movement toward connection or consistent drift away from it. Daniel invested in people even when it was inconvenient, even when it required repair. Ryan spoke about people as if connection were optional and easily replaced. One builds roots, the other avoids them. Emily realized that romantic relationships don't exist in isolation. They reflect the same relational skills or deficits that show up everywhere else. If someone cannot sustain closeness in friendships, they will struggle to sustain it with you once novelty fades. The social proof trap works because it looks like abundance. But abundance without depth is just rotation. Real intimacy leaves traces. It leaves people behind who know you well and still choose you. One, it leaves evidence that you can stay. When Emily stopped asking, "Who do they say they know?" and started asking, "Who actually knows them now?" the picture became much clearer. In the next part, the illusion breaks even further, because the longer the performance continues, the harder it becomes to maintain. And when it does begin to crack, the signs show up not in words, but in the body itself. Performance versus presence. How long can they keep the mask on? Emily used to believe that time revealed character, that if you just waited long enough, people would show you who they really were. What she didn't understand yet was that time doesn't reveal everyone equally. For some people, time brings relaxation. For others, it brings fatigue. That difference is everything. In the beginning, Ryan felt effortless. His posture was confident but relaxed, and his eye contact steady, his attention unwavering. He seemed completely present, so present, in fact, that Emily felt as if nothing else in the room existed when they were together. Conversations flowed without friction. There were no awkward pauses, no missed cues, no emotional missteps. It felt like compatibility. But compatibility doesn't require constant precision. Presence is natural. Performance is maintained. The first cracks didn't appear as words, they appeared as moments. Tiny, almost imperceptible shifts that Emily dismissed because she didn't yet know how to read them. After longer evenings together, 3 hours, then 4, something changed. Ryan's facial expressions flattened. His energy tightened. He still smiled, still nodded, still said the right things, but the warmth behind them thinned, and his breathing moved higher into his chest. His responses came a fraction of a second slower, as if they were being selected rather than felt. Emily noticed herself filling the space more, talking more, laughing louder, carrying the interaction without realizing she was doing it. That wasn't connection. It was compensation. Performance requires fuel, attention, validation, control. When those resources run low, the body betrays what the mind is trying to maintain. People who are truly present don't get exhausted by being themselves. Their energy may ebb and flow, but it doesn't collapse once the interaction passes a certain duration. They don't need to monitor every reaction. They aren't constantly tracking how they're being perceived. With Daniel, time felt different. Long conversations didn't drain him, they softened him. Silences didn't threaten him. They rested between words naturally. He didn't need to steer the emotional temperature of the room. Sometimes he was animated, sometimes he was quiet. The shift felt organic, not strategic. Presence adapts, performance holds. Emily began to understand that what she had mistaken for chemistry with Ryan was actually consistency of presentation. He didn't vary much, not because he was stable, but because variation would have required dropping the mask. The mask isn't always malicious, often it's survival. People who rely on performance learned early that control equals safety. If you can manage the room, manage the narrative, manage the other person's perception, you don't have to feel vulnerable. But vulnerability is the gateway to real intimacy. As weeks passed, the cracks widened. Ryan became less expressive during moments that required empathy. When Emily shared something personal, nothing dramatic, just human uncertainty, his responses felt rehearsed. The words were supportive, but the resonance wasn't there. His face didn't mirror her emotion. His eyes didn't soften. It was as if he was observing rather than experiencing. At first, she told herself he just processed differently. But presence doesn't disappear during vulnerability. It deepens. Daniel's reactions weren't always perfect, but they were congruent. When Emily spoke about something difficult, his body responded before his words did. A slight furrow in his brow. A pause that wasn't empty but attentive. A quiet, "That sounds hard," that landed because it wasn't rushed. That congruence, the alignment between words, body, and timing, is almost impossible to fake over long periods. Performance can imitate presence briefly. It cannot sustain it indefinitely. Emily also noticed how Ryan handled unpredictability. When plans changed suddenly, his composure slipped, not dramatically but noticeably. His tone sharpened, his patience thinned, He recovered quickly, but the recovery itself felt effortful, like watching someone reassemble a carefully arranged structure. Presence doesn't need to recover. It adjusts. Performance resists disruption because disruption threatens control. The longer Emily spent with Ryan, the more she felt she was interacting with a version of him rather than the whole person. A curated self that excelled in short bursts but struggled with endurance. His charm had a time limit, his attentiveness had conditions. And that realization didn't come all at once. It arrived as a quiet accumulation of moments when her body sensed strain even as her mind tried to rationalize it away. With Daniel, there was no on or off. He didn't peak early and fade. He didn't need to maintain an image. Some days he was energized, other days he was tired. The difference was that neither version felt performative. Both felt real. Real people fluctuate, performances flatten. This is why manipulative personalities often prefer environments that reset frequently. Short dates, exciting experiences, novelty-heavy interactions. Newness fuels performance. Routine exposes it. Emily realized that Ryan excelled in beginnings. First impressions, first conversations, first dates. He was magnetic at entry points. But depth required something he struggled to provide. Sustained authenticity. And authenticity isn't about being impressive. It's about being consistent across contexts. Presence allows you to be seen when you're bored, irritated, quiet, or uncertain. Performance avoids those states or masks them quickly. Over time, that avoidance creates tension. Not just in the person performing, but in the person witnessing it. Emily began to feel that tension in her own body. A subtle vigilance, a sense that she needed to stay engaged to keep the connection alive. She felt responsible for the emotional flow of their time together. That responsibility is another sign of performance-based connection. When one person is performing, the other becomes the audience, and audiences feel pressure, whether they can name it or not. With Daniel, Emily never felt like an audience. She felt like a participant. The connection didn't require her to stay on. She could withdraw, reflect, be quiet, and the bond didn't fracture. That's presence. Performance creates excitement. Presence creates safety. And safety over time becomes far more intimate than excitement ever could. Emily didn't need a dramatic reveal to understand this. No explosion, no unmasking scene. Just the slow recognition that the longer she stayed, the less room there was for truth. The mask wasn't slipping because Ryan was cruel or intentionally deceptive. It was slipping because no one can sustain a constructed self indefinitely. Eventually, the body asks for relief. And when the body asks, the mind can no longer keep up the act. This is why time is such a powerful filter. Not because it exposes hidden monsters, but because it reveals capacity. Capacity for presence, capacity for authenticity, capacity for shared reality. Some people can be extraordinary for an evening. Others can be real for a lifetime. Emily stopped asking herself whether Ryan meant well. That question no longer mattered. What mattered was whether she felt like she was with a person or a performance. And once she saw the difference, she couldn't go back. In the next part, the focus shifts even deeper, away from charm, away from narrative, and into the body itself. Because the most reliable signals aren't always spoken. Sometimes they're blinking right in front of you. The after-conversation test, the signal you can't fake. Emily used to believe that what mattered most in dating was how a conversation felt while it was happening. Was it engaging? Did it flow? Did she feel seen? Interesting, alive? She thought those were the markers of connection. It took time and more than a little emotional confusion for her to realize that the real information didn't arrive during the conversation at all. It arrived afterward. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly. in the space where no one else was present to influence the experience. In the minutes and hours after the interaction ended, when her body was no longer responding to another person's cues, something more honest took over. With Ryan, that honesty showed up as a strange internal noise. After they said goodbye, Emily's mind stayed busy. She replayed moments, analyzed tone, wondered what certain comments meant. She felt alert, slightly restless, as if something unfinished were hovering just out of reach. Even when the conversation had been enjoyable, her nervous system didn't settle. It stayed activated, scanning, anticipating. She told herself this was excitement, attraction, chemistry. But chemistry doesn't make your body feel unresolved. With Daniel, the aftermath was different. When conversations ended, they ended. Emily didn't feel the need to revisit every sentence or decode hidden meaning. There was no emotional residue demanding attention. She felt calmer, more herself, sometimes even a little sleepy. Her body returned to baseline without effort. At first, she dismissed this difference as personality. Maybe Ryan was just more stimulating. Maybe Daniel was quieter. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One connection left her regulated. The other left her activated. That distinction is the core of the after-conversation test, and it's one of the most reliable signals you will ever encounter, because it cannot be consciously controlled. During a conversation, people can perform. They can mirror, charm, listen attentively, say the right things. But what happens after the interaction is no longer under their influence. What happens then belongs to your nervous system alone. And your nervous system doesn't care about potential, excuses, or explanation. It cares about safety. When an interaction is rooted in genuine presence and mutual regulation, your body interprets it as safe. The parasympathetic nervous system activates. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, muscles release tension. You feel grounded even if the conversation touched on meaningful or emotional topics. When an interaction is rooted in manipulation, intensity, or subtle power imbalance, your body stays alert. Cortisol lingers, thoughts race. You feel compelled to make sense of something that never quite resolves. That compulsion is not romance. It's vigilance. Emily began to notice how her body reacted in the quiet moments after seeing Ryan. She felt a subtle pressure to stay available, even when nothing had been explicitly asked of her. A pull to check her phone, a readiness to respond. It was as if the interaction hadn't concluded. It had merely paused. That lingering pull is not connection. It's unfinished business created by emotional ambiguity. Manipulative personalities are especially skilled at leaving interactions open-ended. Not obviously so. Not in a way that can be easily pointed out, but in a way that subtly keeps your attention tethered to them. A half smile, a comment that could be interpreted multiple ways, a warmth that appears and disappears without explanation. Your brain tries to resolve the ambiguity by staying engaged. With Daniel, there was no ambiguity to resolve. What he expressed matched how he behaved. The interaction completed itself naturally. Emily didn't feel the need to chase clarity because clarity had already been provided. This is why the after-conversation test is so powerful. You don't need to ask yourself whether the person was kind, interesting, or attentive. You only need to notice what your body does when they're gone. Do you feel more settled or more stirred up? More clear or more confused? More grounded or more alert? Ryan didn't leave Emily feeling bad. That's what made it tricky. He left her feeling activated, and activation can be addictive. There's a cultural narrative that equates intensity with depth, and that frames calm as boredom and steadiness as lack of passion. But from a nervous system perspective, intensity without safety is not intimacy. It's stress dressed up as excitement. Emily realized that after conversations with Ryan, she felt a subtle urgency, a sense that something important was happening that she needed to stay on top of. Her body didn't relax into the experience, it stayed on standby. After conversations with Daniel, urgency dissolved. There was nothing to manage, nothing to decode, nothing to secure. That absence of urgency wasn't dullness. It was trust. Trust doesn't demand attention. Anxiety does. This is where many people get trapped. They assume that the person who leaves them thinking more must matter more. They interpret mental preoccupation as emotional depth, but preoccupation is often just your nervous system trying to regain equilibrium. Manipulative interactions disrupt equilibrium. They create emotional asymmetry. One person leaves feeling energized and in control. The other leaves feeling unsettled and searching for footing. Emily noticed that Ryan often seemed perfectly fine after their conversations. Relaxed, unbothered. He didn't follow up quickly or wonder aloud about what things meant. He appeared regulated. That imbalance told the story words never did. When one person consistently leaves interactions calm and the other leaves activated, the calm person is not necessarily healthier, but they are often holding more power in the dynamic. Daniel didn't leave Emily activated because he wasn't extracting something from the interaction. He wasn't feeding on her attention, admiration, or emotional labor. He wasn't calibrating her responses to maintain control. He was simply present. Presence completes interactions. Performance keeps them open. Emily began using the after-conversation test intentionally, not as a rule, but as a point of curiosity. She stopped evaluating dates by how impressed she felt and started noticing how her body behaved afterward. Did she breathe more deeply or more shallowly? Did her thoughts slow down or speed up? Did she feel whole or oddly fragmented? The answers were always consistent, even when her mind tried to argue. This test works because it bypasses storytelling. It doesn't rely on insight, experience, or education. It doesn't require you to diagnose anyone or justify your instincts. It simply asks you to notice your internal state once the influence of the other person has ended. You cannot fake the effect you have on someone's nervous system over time. Ryan could be charming, attentive, and engaging, but he could not make Emily's body feel safe once he was gone. The stimulation lingered without comfort. Daniel didn't create fireworks. He created coherence. Emily understood then that the most important signal in dating isn't attraction, it's regulation. Real connection allows your nervous system to rest. Manipulation keeps it on watch. And the reason this signal matters so much is that it shows up early, long before patterns escalate, before attachment forms, before leaving becomes complicated. The after-conversation test doesn't ask you to walk away immediately. It asks you to listen, because when something is right, your body doesn't need to recover from it. It returns to itself. In the next part, the lens tightens even further, moving from internal sensations to observable behaviors. Because when stress rises, the body always responds, and those responses leave traces no amount of charm can hide. Why you ignore red flags. Even when you see them, Emily didn't miss the red flags. That was the part that haunted her the most. She remembered the moments clearly, the subtle discomfort, the questions that surfaced and were quickly pushed aside, the quiet internal signals that told her something didn't align. None of it was invisible. None of it was unconscious. She saw it all. She just didn't stop, and for a long time she believed that meant she had failed herself. But the truth was more complicated and far more human. Ignoring red flags isn't about lack of intelligence or awareness. It's about what happens when perception collides with identity. When what you see threatens the story you're already living inside. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when two conflicting beliefs exist at the same time. The brain, wired for coherence, resolves that discomfort not by choosing truth, but by choosing comfort. Emily experienced this every time a red flag appeared. When Ryan deflected responsibility, her mind didn't say, "That's a pattern." It said, "Maybe he's just been hurt." When he subtly reframed events to position himself as the reasonable one, her mind didn't say, "That feels manipulative." It said, "I don't know his full story yet." Each red flag created tension between what she was observing and what she wanted to believe. And wanting is powerful. She wanted to believe the connection was real. She wanted to believe her judgment was improving. She wanted to believe that this time would be different, that she was wiser now, more discerning, less likely to repeat old mistakes. Those wants weren't shallow. They were tied to her identity as someone who learns, grows, and chooses better. So when evidence appeared that contradicted that identity, her brain worked overtime to neutralize it. That's how cognitive dissonance protects itself, not by denying facts outright, but by reframing them just enough to preserve the story. Emily told herself she was being open-minded, compassionate, patient. What she didn't realize was that she was also negotiating with reality. Red flags rarely announce themselves as danger. They appear as ambiguity, as moments that can be interpreted multiple ways. And when chemistry is strong, when hope is invested, when attachment has begun even slightly, the brain will always choose the interpretation that allows the story to continue. Because stopping hurts. Stopping means admitting that something you were excited about isn't what you thought it was. It means grieving potential before it fully forms. It means letting go not just of a person, but of the future you had already begun to imagine. That loss feels personal, even when the relationship is still new. Emily noticed this pattern most clearly when she compared her reactions to Ryan and Daniel. When Daniel showed uncertainty or flaw, it didn't threaten her narrative. His honesty aligned with her sense of safety. There was nothing to defend against. When Ryan showed inconsistency, her mind rushed to protect the connection, and it offered explanations before she even asked for them. It smoothed over discomfort instead of sitting with it. That difference wasn't about who was better. It was about which connection had already begun to anchor her sense of meaning. Cognitive dissonance doesn't arise from bad behavior alone. It arises when bad behavior conflicts with hope, and hope is sticky. The more emotional energy you invest early, through intense conversations, vulnerability, shared meaning, the harder it becomes to walk away when something feels off. Your brain begins to associate the person with identity-level beliefs. I chose this. I saw something special. I'm not wrong about this. So when a red flag appears, it's not just information, it's a threat to self-trust. Emily didn't want to believe she could be wrong again, when she didn't want to believe she had misread the situation. She didn't want to feel foolish for having felt so much so quickly. So instead of questioning the connection, she questioned herself. Am I being too sensitive? Am I overanalyzing? Is this my old pattern showing up again? Those questions sound self-aware, they sound responsible, but when they're used repeatedly to override clear internal signals, they become self-erasing. Ryan didn't need to gaslight her directly. Her own mind did most of the work. That's the quiet danger of cognitive dissonance. It recruits your intelligence against you. The smarter and more reflective you are, the better you become at rationalizing discomfort. You don't ignore red flags because you don't see them. You ignore them because seeing them costs too much, and the cost isn't logical, it's emotional. Emily also noticed how timing played a role. The red flags didn't appear before she cared. They appeared after the late-night conversations, after the feeling of being chosen, after the sense that something meaningful was unfolding. By the time the discomfort surfaced, the connection already had momentum. Momentum creates commitment before clarity. This is why manipulative dynamics often escalate quickly. not necessarily physically or emotionally in obvious ways, but internally. The bond forms fast, the story forms fast, and once it does, your brain becomes invested in defending it against doubt, defending it against contradiction, defending it against your own instincts. Emily realized that the red flags she ignored weren't invisible. They were inconvenient. Each one required her to pause, slow down, and potentially walk away. And walking away would have meant facing the grief of unrealized possibility. So she delayed, and delay has consequences. Cognitive dissonance doesn't resolve itself by waiting. It compounds. Each ignored signal increases the pressure to ignore the next one. Each rationalization makes the next rationalization easier. Over time, this creates a dangerous internal split. Part of you knows something is wrong. Another part is committed to making it work. That split is exhausting. Emily felt it as a low-level anxiety she couldn't explain, a constant background hum of uncertainty. She wasn't unhappy, but she wasn't at peace either. That state wasn't accidental. It was the cost of holding two conflicting realities at once. Daniel never created that split, even when things were unclear, and Emily didn't feel divided against herself. Her instincts and her reasoning stayed aligned. There was no internal debate that required constant management. That alignment is what safety feels like. Looking back, Emily understood that the red flags weren't the real issue. The real issue was the story she felt compelled to protect. Once she allowed herself to release that story, not angrily, not dramatically, but honestly, the dissonance dissolved. The red flags didn't need interpretation anymore. They simply became information. She learned something essential then. Red flags don't ask you to panic. They ask you to pause. They ask you to stop narrating and start noticing. To let go of who you hope someone might be and pay attention to who they are when there's nothing to gain. Ignoring red flags doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. It means you care. It means you attach meaning quickly and deeply. But healing begins when compassion includes yourself. When you stop using empathy to override your intuition. When you stop mistaking patience for endurance. When you allow clarity to matter more than potential. Emily didn't become wiser by learning how to spot red flags faster. She became wiser by learning how to stop explaining them away. In the next part, everything narrows down to a single moment. One simple test that cuts through charm, confusion, and cognitive dissonance alike. A moment where the mask has nowhere left to hide. The dating checklist. How to screen without becoming cold or paranoid. Emily didn't want to become guarded. That was her quiet fear after everything she'd learned, after recognizing patterns, after understanding how easily chemistry could mask danger, after realizing how often empathy had been used against her. She didn't want to date like a detective or interrogate people like suspects. She didn't want to lose warmth, softness, or hope. And she didn't have to. The turning point came when she understood that screening isn't about suspicion. It's about alignment. It's not about catching someone doing something wrong. It's about noticing what feels right without forcing it to make sense. A healthy dating checklist isn't a list you run against someone. It's a set of internal reference points you run within yourself. Emily learned that the goal wasn't to harden her heart, but to steady it. She stopped asking, "And is this person safe?" a question loaded with fear and hypervigilance, and began asking something far more grounded. How does my body behave around them over time? That shift changed everything. She noticed that with Daniel, she didn't need to stay alert. She didn't need to manage impressions or anticipate reactions. She didn't rehearse what she would say next. She showed up as she was, and the connection met her there. With Ryan, she had unconsciously monitored herself. Not because he asked her to, but because something in her sensed that stability depended on staying in tune. The checklist she eventually developed didn't condemn that experience. It clarified it. The first reference point wasn't behavior. It was regulation. Emily asked herself whether interactions left her more settled or more activated. Not excited versus bored. Those are misleading categories. But regulated versus unsettled. She learned to trust that calm didn't mean disinterest. It meant safety. A nervous system that can relax is not a sign of low chemistry. It's a sign of compatibility. The second reference point was consistency without effort. She didn't look for perfection, she looked for congruence. Did the person's tone, words, and behavior align over time? Did kindness appear only during peak moments, or did it extend into inconvenience, fatigue, and disagreement? Daniel's consistency wasn't impressive. It was quiet, predictable in the best way. Ryan's consistency required energy. It appeared strongest when he was engaged, admired, or leading the interaction. Emily realized that real consistency doesn't need maintenance, and it doesn't fluctuate dramatically based on context. The third reference point was response to boundaries. She didn't set boundaries as tests. She set them as expressions of self-respect and watched what happened next. When she needed space, when she disagreed, when she didn't respond immediately. Did the connection remain intact? Daniel didn't need explanations. He didn't interpret boundaries as rejection. There was no emotional consequence for asserting herself. Ryan didn't explode or accuse, but something shifted. The warmth cooled. The rhythm changed. There was a subtle sense of cost. Emily learned that healthy people may feel disappointment, but they don't punish autonomy. The fourth reference point was curiosity versus conclusion. She noticed whether someone approached life and her with openness or certainty. Did they speak as if they were still learning about themselves, or as if they had already arrived at fixed truths? Daniel spoke in progress. Ryan spoke in verdicts. Curiosity invites growth. Certainty resists it. Emily stopped mistaking confidence for depth. She realized that the ability to say "I don't know yet" was not weakness. It was emotional flexibility. The fifth reference point was social reality. She didn't count friends or measure popularity. She simply observed whether the person had people in their life who knew them now. People who saw them regularly. People who had context, memory, and shared reality. Daniel's life included others naturally. Ryan's stories were often about elsewhere, before, or someday. Emily learned that romantic connection doesn't exist in isolation, and it reflects the same relational skills a person brings everywhere else. The sixth reference point was repair. No relationship unfolds without missteps. What mattered wasn't avoiding discomfort, it was how it was handled. When something felt off, could it be named? When tension arose, did it lead to understanding or deflection? Daniel didn't rush repair. He stayed present through it. Ryan reframed, minimized, or redirected. Repair requires accountability. Without it, intimacy becomes fragile. As Emily lived into these reference points, something unexpected happened. She softened, not because she lowered her standards, but because she stopped bracing for disappointment. The checklist didn't make her suspicious, it made her calm. She wasn't scanning for danger, she was listening for coherence. And coherence feels unmistakable when you let yourself feel it. The most important realization of all was this: screening doesn't happen in your head, it happens in your body. You don't need to memorize rules or analyze every interaction. You need to notice patterns over time. How often you feel at ease, how often you feel responsible for maintaining connection, how often you feel confused after clarity should have arrived. Emily stopped explaining away signals. She stopped collecting data to prove a story. She allowed herself to gather information without forcing a conclusion. That patience didn't delay clarity. It accelerated it. Ryan didn't become more dangerous when she stopped chasing certainty. He became less interesting. The pull weakened when it was no longer fed by vigilance. Daniel didn't become more exciting. He became more solid. And that solidity mattered. Emily also learned that screening doesn't require confrontation. You don't need to call out patterns prematurely or announce your observations. People reveal themselves naturally when you stop over-accommodating, when you slow down, when you don't rush intimacy, when you don't fill silence, when you don't rescue discomfort. The right people stay. The wrong ones fade or push. Both outcomes are informative. She realized that paranoia comes from trying to protect yourself through control. Discernment comes from trusting your capacity to notice and respond. The checklist wasn't something she carried into dates. It was something she carried within herself. A commitment to staying present to her own experience. She didn't need to diagnose Ryan or label him anything, and she didn't need to convince herself he was bad. She only needed to accept that the connection required her to abandon herself in small ways, and she was no longer willing to do that. Healthy screening doesn't harden you, it frees you. It allows you to remain open without being exposed, warm without being porous, compassionate without being consumed. Emily discovered that safety isn't the absence of risk, it's the presence of self-trust. And when self-trust is intact, you don't become cold, you become clear. In the final part, that clarity turns inward because the most powerful protection isn't spotting narcissists or psychopaths. It's understanding what draws you towards certain dynamics in the first place and how to choose differently without losing yourself in the process. You're not broken. You're becoming harder to manipulate. You're not broken. You're becoming harder to manipulate. Emily used to believe something was wrong with her, not in an obvious way, not in the way people talk about trauma or dysfunction, but in the quieter, more corrosive way, an internal suspicion that she was somehow wired incorrectly. Too sensitive, too trusting, too affected by connection, too easily pulled into intensity and left questioning herself afterward. Every time a relationship unraveled in a familiar pattern, that belief deepened. If I keep ending up here, maybe I'm the problem. That thought is one of the most powerful tools manipulation ever uses. Not because it's true, but because it feels plausible. Emily didn't arrive at clarity through blame. She arrived there through exhaustion, and through the slow realization that the very qualities she'd been criticizing, empathy, openness, emotional depth, were not flaws. They were strengths that had been unprotected, and unprotected strengths are easy to exploit. The moment everything shifted was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no final argument, no villain revealed. There was just a quiet recognition. The confusion she'd felt wasn't random. It had a pattern. And that pattern didn't originate in her inadequacy. It originated in dynamics that rewarded her self-doubt and punished her self-trust. Manipulation doesn't begin by overpowering you. It begins by recruiting you. It recruits your kindness to excuse behavior that should be questioned, your intelligence to rationalize what your body already knows, your self-awareness to override your instincts in the name of growth. Emily realized she hadn't been failing to see reality. She had been trained, slowly, subtly, to doubt her interpretation of it. That training doesn't happen overnight. It happens in moments where your discomfort is reframed as misunderstanding, where your boundaries are treated as sensitivity, where your need for clarity is labeled pressure. Over time, you stop asking, "Is this right for me?" and start asking, "What's wrong with me for feeling this way?" That is not love, it is erosion. When Emily finally stepped out of that pattern, the fear wasn't loneliness, it was identity loss. She worried that without intensity, without challenge, without emotional highs and lows, connection would feel empty. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. Calm did not register as safety at first. It registered as absence. Her nervous system, long accustomed to activation, I didn't immediately recognize regulation as something good. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. When you've been conditioned by intensity, peace can feel like disconnection. Not because it is, but because your system hasn't recalibrated yet. Emily didn't suddenly become confident. She became quieter inside. She noticed she no longer rehearsed conversations before having them. She no longer scanned for reactions mid-sentence. She didn't feel the need to explain her feelings perfectly to make them acceptable. She didn't need to manage outcomes. Nothing about her became harder. She became steadier, and steadiness is kryptonite to manipulation. Manipulative dynamics require movement, emotional urgency, uncertainty, imbalance. They require you to stay slightly off-center, slightly unsure, slightly invested in proving something. When you stop oscillating, the dynamic loses its grip. Ryan didn't disappear from Emily's life with drama. He simply lost relevance. The pull weakened when it was no longer fueled by self-doubt. When she stopped chasing clarity, there was nothing left to chase. Daniel didn't become more exciting, he became more visible. In the absence of noise, presence stood out. Emily understood then that being harder to manipulate doesn't mean being suspicious or guarded. It means being anchored. Anchored enough that when something feels off, you don't need permission to pause. You don't need proof to step back. You don't need to justify your experience to anyone else. You trust the signal. That trust didn't come from learning more red flags. It came from learning herself. She learned that her body had always known, and that the emptiness after certain conversations wasn't longing. It was depletion. That the anxiety she'd felt wasn't excitement. It was vigilance. That the confusion she blamed on overthinking was actually the cost of holding incompatible realities at once. Once she stopped pathologizing those responses, they transformed into guidance. Emily also let go of another damaging belief, that being manipulated meant she was weak. Manipulation does not target weakness. It targets capacity. The capacity to care deeply, to empathize, to imagine futures, to stay open. People who lack those qualities are not safer. They're just less available. What makes you harder to manipulate is not less feeling. It's more integration. Integration is when your thoughts, emotions, and bodily signals move together instead of against each other. It is when you don't force coherence where it doesn't exist. When you allow discomfort to inform you instead of threaten you. Emily stopped asking herself how to be less affected. She asked how to stay connected to herself while being affected. That changed how she dated, but more importantly, it changed how she lived. She spoke more slowly. She waited longer before attaching meaning. She allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. She noticed when her energy shifted and didn't argue with it. None of this made her cold. It made her selective. And selectivity is not fear. It is discernment born of respect for your own experience. Emily realized that the goal was never to avoid all pain. Pain is part of intimacy. The goal was to avoid pain that comes from self-abandonment. Pain that accumulates quietly because you keep explaining away what your nervous system is trying to tell you. She learned that healthy relationships do not require you to contort, convince, or constantly calibrate. They don't ask you to disappear in increments. They don't thrive on confusion. They allow you to stay whole. If you see yourself in Emily's story, this is the part that matters most. You are not broken because you cared. You are not broken because you hoped. You are not broken because you stayed longer than you should have. You stayed because something in you believed connection was worth fighting for. Now, something wiser in you knows that connection should not require a fight against yourself. Becoming harder to manipulate doesn't mean becoming closed. It means becoming unavailable to dynamics that require you to doubt your reality to sustain them. It means recognizing that clarity is not boring. Calm is not empty. And steadiness is not a lack of passion. It means understanding that when something is right, your body does not need to recover from it. Emily didn't end her journey with certainty about love. She ended it with certainty about herself. And that certainty didn't shout. It didn't demand validation. It didn't need to be proven. It simply stayed. That is what healing looks like. Not dramatic, not perfect, not immune to pain, but grounded enough to walk away from what erodes you without questioning your worth. You're not broken. You're becoming harder to manipulate because you're finally listening to the part of you that always knew. And that part doesn't need fixing, and it needs trust. Conclusion: what Emily's story really teaches us. Emily's story is not about a single relationship. It is about a pattern so many people live inside without realizing it has a shape, a rhythm, and a cost. It begins with connection that feels rare and intoxicating, continues through confusion that quietly erodes self-trust, and ends, if you're lucky, with a reckoning that changes how you relate not just to others but to yourself. Emily didn't start this journey naive or unaware. She was thoughtful, reflective, and emotionally intelligent, and that is precisely why the dynamic worked for as long as it did. She wasn't blind to the signs. She was negotiating with them. Every time something felt off, she searched for explanations instead of listening to impact. Every time her body signaled depletion, her mind rushed in with empathy and logic. Over time, that internal split became the most painful part of the experience. What ultimately freed her was not learning how to label people, but learning how to read herself. She began to notice patterns rather than moments. How she felt after interactions instead of during them. Whether calm followed connection or whether her nervous system stayed on alert. Whether closeness expanded her sense of self or subtly required her to manage, adjust, and perform. Slowly, she realized that what she had been calling chemistry was often just activation, and what she had been dismissing as boring was actually safety. The most powerful lesson in Emily's story is this: you don't heal by becoming less open. You heal by becoming more anchored. Manipulative dynamics thrive when you doubt your perceptions and override your instincts in the name of patience, understanding, or hope. They weaken when you slow down, stop chasing clarity, and allow your internal experience to matter without needing external validation. Emily didn't need closure from anyone else. She needed coherence within herself. This story invites you to shift how you approach connection in your own life, not by scanning for red flags obsessively, but by cultivating self-trust deeply. Notice how your body feels when someone enters and leaves your space. Pay attention to whether relationships require you to abandon yourself in small, habitual ways. Ask whether calm feels unfamiliar because it's wrong or because it's new. Applying this in real life doesn't mean becoming cold, suspicious, or emotionally distant, and it means honoring pace, allowing time to reveal consistency, setting boundaries without apology and observing responses without explaining them away. It means understanding that you don't owe access to anyone who destabilizes your inner world, no matter how compelling the story feels. Most importantly, Emily's journey reminds us that if you've been confused, depleted, or caught in patterns that didn't make sense at the time, that does not mean you are broken. It means you are open in a world that does not always handle openness with care. The goal isn't to harden your heart. It's to protect your alignment. When you stop arguing with your instincts, clarity doesn't shout. It settles. And from that place, your choices change naturally. And disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional diagnosis, therapy, or treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Quick question for you. When you think about your past connections, which feels more true? A. I often felt calm, grounded, and more myself over time. B. I often felt confused, activated, or emotionally drained afterward. Comment A or B below. What part of Emily's story resonated most with you? Do you agree with these insights, or do you see things differently? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. And if this content helped you see relationships more clearly, please subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible to keep creating honest, thoughtful content like this. Content that helps people reconnect with themselves while navigating connection with others.